New sister-in-law ordered me to erase my disabled daughter from wedding pics. My brother heard and... My name is John, and I never imagined I'd be the father of a little girl with special needs. Yet here I am, sharing my story about my daughter, Katie, a 5-year-old with a partial paralysis that prevents her from moving below her chest. My wife, Linda, and I live in a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York, where the summers are warm and the winters hit hard, but we wouldn't trade it for anything. It's where our extended family lives, and that sense of closeness was important to us, especially after Katie was born. I still remember the day the doctors told us Katie's diagnosis. Linda clutched my hand so tightly I thought my fingers would break, and when the words partial paralysis came out of the doctor's mouth, my whole world seemed to tilt. We spent the next few months in a haze, meeting with specialists, hoping for a miracle. We went from one hospital to the next, seeking any glimmer of hope that maybe some new treatment or surgery could help Katie regain movement. But eventually, we had to face the reality. Her condition was permanent. Those were the darkest days of our lives, days filled with tears, late-night arguments, and a kind of sorrow that's hard to put into words. Linda withdrew into herself for a while, and I had trouble focusing on anything besides fixing our daughter's situation. But you learn quickly that there's no quick fix. You adapt, change your perspective, and start celebrating the small victories. A smile, a giggle, her discovering a new way to pick up a toy or interact with the world around her. During that period, we received a mixed reaction from relatives. Some were supportive, always checking in on us or offering help in practical ways, like cooking meals or babysitting so Linda and I could catch a breath. Others didn't react so kindly. My own mother, Helen, was so shocked by Katie's condition that she suggested I try for another baby, one who could, in her words, walk and do normal stuff. I stood there, stunned, unable to believe my mother would dismiss Katie so easily. It felt like a betrayal, and if it weren't for my younger brother, David, stepping in to defend me and Katie, I might have cut contact entirely. David, bless him, has been our rock from the start. He's 4 years younger than me and single. He's the fun uncle every kid dreams of. While some family members stared at Katie's wheelchair in awkward discomfort, David treated her like any other child, playing games, telling jokes, and figuring out little ways to make her laugh. It didn't matter that she couldn't run around or climb on his back. David adapted to her needs without a second thought. Instead of piggyback rides, he'd gently push her around in her specialized wheelchair, racing through the living room like it was a high-speed chase in a movie. If Katie giggled, David considered the day a success. That's what made him such a vital part of our lives, his unwavering acceptance. As Katie grew older, she saw David as a source of constant joy and unconditional love, something we'd hoped all our relatives would provide but didn't. His presence helped me realize that while life for Katie would be different, it could still be filled with laughter, belonging, and a sense that she was every bit as worthy as any other child. And that's how our family was, fragile, but held together by love, especially David's devotion to Katie. Little did we know that in the months ahead, this fragile piece would be tested in ways we never saw coming. When David announced he was getting married to Amelia, everyone in the family buzzed with excitement. David had always been the fun-loving, easygoing member of our clan, and I was thrilled that he'd found someone he wanted to spend his life with. Although I hadn't spent much time around Amelia, she seemed polite enough during the few family gatherings we'd had. I told myself this was David's choice, and if he was happy, then I was happy for him. The wedding was set for midsummer, in a beautiful garden overlooking the Hudson River. Early on, Amelia announced through her meticulously designed invitations that this event would be completely child-free, no exceptions. She insisted it would be a more elegant and intimate affair if no one had to worry about wrangling children, and in fairness, some couples do choose that kind of environment for their big day. However, about 2 weeks before the wedding, David called me up unexpectedly. His tone was tentative, but there was a hint of excitement there too. "John," he began, "Amelia and I have been discussing something. I know we said no kids, but I can't imagine getting married without Katie there. I want her to be my flower girl." I was caught off guard. I reminded David of Amelia's very specific rule: no children. But David insisted that he'd already cleared it with her. She wasn't thrilled at first, he admitted, but she knows how much Katie means to me. His voice softened. Katie's been such a big part of my life. You know, I want her to roll down the aisle, tossing petals if she can. It'd make my wedding perfect. I felt a mixture of relief and gratitude wash over me. Katie adored David, and the thought of her missing his wedding had been a little disappointing to her, even if she hadn't fully expressed it. The idea that she could participate in such a special role was heartwarming. I quickly agreed, touched by my brother's thoughtful gesture. But when Amelia reached out to me a few days later, I realized that maybe her agreement wasn't quite as enthusiastic as David had implied. First, she wanted me to confirm, in writing, that Katie would be kept quiet during the ceremony. Then, she started laying out a series of oddly specific demands about Katie's attire. Amelia emailed me a list. The color of Katie's dress must be a specific shade of cream. Not white, not beige, but cream with a hint of blush. She attached color swatches to ensure I understood. Her hairstyle must be kept neat and tidy, and absolutely no oversized hair accessories. Her wheelchair, which Katie relies on, should be tastefully decorated to fit the wedding theme, but also not too flashy because Amelia didn't want it drawing attention. The demands didn't end there. Amelia even instructed me to send her a photo of the final dress choice and of how Katie's hair would look on the big day. It was all so detailed, so controlling, that I felt a twinge of unease. Yet, outwardly, Amelia made it sound as though she was simply trying to ensure a consistent aesthetic. When I asked David about it, he seemed puzzled. She just wants it to be cohesive, he said, brushing off my concerns. You know how brides can be about their color schemes. I wanted to believe that was all it was, a bride to be stressing about details. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Amelia's requests bordered on overbearing. Katie was a child with special needs, not a prop to be perfectly placed for photos. Still, for David's sake, I decided to comply. If this was the cost of letting Katie be at her uncle's wedding, so be it. So, I found myself taking measurements and hunting down the right shade of cream for Katie's dress. Each time I tried to involve Katie in the decision, Amelia would swoop in with more precise instructions. Meanwhile, David remained blissfully unaware, focusing on finalizing the guest list and the catering menu. The wedding day inched closer, and while Katie was excited, thrilled, actually, to be David's flower girl, I was growing uneasy. The child-free rule that once seemed straightforward was now blurred for our family alone, and the bride's excessive demands hinted that perhaps this concession had been made grudgingly. My daughter deserved to feel welcomed, not merely tolerated, on such a special occasion. But in the flurry of pre-wedding chaos, I tried to set aside my doubts, hoping Amelia's over-planning was just a bit of bridal nerves. I could not have been more wrong. With only a few weeks left before the wedding, Amelia's demands about Katie's attire went from controlling to downright exhausting. One day, she'd approve of a particular cream-colored dress with the tiniest hint of blush. By the next morning, she'd change her mind, claiming the shade was too off-white or that the fabric wasn't flowy enough. I spent hours driving around town, scouting bridal shops and children's boutiques in search of the perfect dress that would appease her ever-shifting standards. Each time I thought I'd found the right one, Amelia would reject it with a flippant text, referencing a color swatch or some obscure detail she'd previously never mentioned. It wasn't just the dress. Amelia also insisted on reviewing possible hairstyles for Katie, demanding that any hair accessories be small and understated, so as not to distract from the bride. I could sense her irritation each time I tried to remind her that my daughter has partial paralysis. Helping Katie get ready wasn't as simple as taking any other child to the salon. But Amelia seemed more concerned with her wedding aesthetic than my child's comfort. Despite this, Katie's excitement never waned. She kept beaming at the thought of being a flower girl for Uncle David. In her mind, it was a dream come true, being included in such an important family event and wearing a pretty dress. Every time she caught me on the phone with Amelia, she'd will over in her chair, eager to hear any updates on how she'd look or which flowers she'd be tossing. Her innocent enthusiasm made me even more determined to shield her from Amelia's controlling behavior. When the big day finally arrived, the tension that had been building felt almost suffocating. But once Katie rolled down the aisle in the final, approved dress, all eyes were on her in the best possible way. She wore a wide smile that radiated pure joy, scattering petals from her wheelchair as she went. The guests seemed captivated by her sweetness and confidence. People whispered compliments. Some even wiped away tears, touched by how beautifully Katie performed her role. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of David beaming at her with brotherly pride. Amelia, however, kept a polite but distant expression. She offered a thin smile whenever someone praised Katie, but it never reached her eyes. Throughout the ceremony, I noticed her stealing glances at Katie as if she were annoyed by the attention Katie was receiving. Perhaps Amelia had wanted the spotlight solely for herself, and my daughter's performance had inadvertently shared that spotlight. After the vows were exchanged and the reception began, Amelia suggested a separate family photo shoot near the garden. The plan sounded innocent enough at first, but as soon as we started lining up for pictures, her dissatisfaction with Katie's presence resurfaced. At first, it was small hints, a sigh here, a roll of the eyes there. Then she began directing the photographer to take photos of just the core family, or just siblings, or just the bride's immediate family. Katie was quickly shuffled out of the frame. Though David insisted on a few shots with Katie included, Amelia's impatience became harder and harder to ignore. Watching it all unfold, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. Katie, thankfully, didn't seem to notice Amelia's subtle hostility. She was too busy soaking in the moment, reveling in the novelty of wearing a pretty dress and having her picture taken. I, on the other hand, could see Amelia's composure fraying with every flash of the camera. It felt like I was witnessing a spark that would soon ignite something much bigger. And I was right. A few days after the wedding, David and Amelia invited our family over to their new home for a casual post-wedding lunch, sort of a final celebration before they headed off on a short honeymoon. I felt a mix of curiosity and unease, remembering Amelia's tense demeanor during the wedding photos. Nonetheless, David sounded excited on the phone, so I convinced myself it might be a chance for Amelia and me to smooth things over. When we arrived, David ushered Katie into the living room with a broad smile, offering her a small gift he'd picked up from one of the local shops as a belated thank you for being the flower girl. Katie's eyes lit up as she unwrapped a little figurine of a girl in a flowing cream-colored dress, matching the one she had worn. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. David doted on Katie, and Amelia hovered in the background, forcing a polite grin. But after lunch, when my daughter and parents were in the next room chatting with David about honeymoon stories, Amelia approached me. She asked if we could speak in private. I nodded, suspecting she wanted to address the awkwardness from the wedding day. She led me down the hallway and into a small guest room, closing the door behind us. Her demeanor changed instantly. The polite smile dropped, replaced by a cold firmness. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the digital wedding album provided by the photographer, stopping on a photo featuring Katie, smiling in her wheelchair next to David. Amelia turned the screen toward me. "Look," she said flatly, "don't you see how the wheelchair ruins the aesthetic? It's all anyone can notice." My pulse quickened. I stared at the image, seeing nothing but my daughter's radiant smile. "Katie looks beautiful," I replied, my voice tight. She was thrilled to be included. Amelia exhaled, rolling her eyes. "I'm not saying she didn't do a good job, but these pictures, I want them to be perfect. I've talked to a photo editor who can remove the wheelchair or even, crop Katie out entirely. It wouldn't be too expensive." I could feel my hands begin to tremble. "You're joking," I said, hoping she was. But the unwavering set of her jaw told me she was dead serious. "She's your daughter," Amelia said with a dismissive shrug. "So I figured you'd be the one to pay for the edits. I mean, it's only fair. She's the reason the pictures need such extensive retouching." Fury and disbelief warred inside me. "You want me to pay someone to erase my daughter from the wedding photos?" My voice rose, and I quickly tried to lower it so the rest of the family wouldn't hear. That's disgusting." Amelia stood her ground, crossing her arms. "It's not about her as a person, it's about the visuals. Everyone's focusing on the wheelchair instead of the rest of us. No offense, but this was my wedding. I should get the pictures I want." I felt my face flush hot with anger. My daughter has a disability, Amelia. You invited her. Actually, you allowed David to invite her. Now you want to pretend she wasn't even there? That's cruel and insulting. I struggled for the words, ableist, and I won't stand for it. A brief flicker of alarm crossed her eyes before she pressed her lips together. Don't throw that word around, she hissed. It's not about discriminating. It's about my right to have perfect wedding pictures. Perfection at the cost of my child's existence? I shot back. I'm not going to pay a dime to support this twisted idea. Our voices had grown loud enough that David, sensing the tension, burst into the room. One look at Amelia's face, and he demanded an explanation. She tried to deflect, but I had no intention of staying silent. I told him everything about the Photoshop request, her claim that the wheelchair ruined her pictures, and how she expected me to foot the bill. David's face darkened as he turned to Amelia. Is this true? He demanded. The guilt in her eyes answered long before she spoke, and in that moment, the tenuous peace that had existed shattered, revealing just how deep Amelia's resentment toward Katie really went. Before I realized what I was doing, my hand lashed out and connected with Amelia's cheek, a sharp, humiliating slap that echoed in the small guest room. My chest felt tight and my heart hammered against my ribs. I'd never in my life hit anyone like that, let alone a family member by marriage. But Amelia's cold words about photoshopping my daughter out of her wedding pictures had snapped something inside me. For a moment, we both froze. Amelia's eyes went wide in shock, and I could see my own reflection in her gaze. Eyes blazing, breath coming in ragged gasps. I opened my mouth to apologize, but my voice refused to come. A swirl of shame and anger roiled inside me. Just then, the door burst open. David stood there, flanked by our parents, their faces betraying confusion and alarm. My mother immediately stepped forward, looking from Amelia's red cheek to my trembling hand. My father's brows knit together as he took in the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. David's gaze darted between Amelia and me. What's going on in here? He demanded, his tone already edged with worry. He noticed Amelia's furious expression and my clenched fists. Amelia found her voice first, screeching, He hit me. She held her cheek dramatically, as though she wanted to prove the worst possible scenario. He's out of control. My mother gasped, and my father stepped closer, protective yet needing answers. David's eyes locked onto mine, silently asking me to explain. Words tumbled out of me in a rush. I told them how Amelia had demanded that I pay to remove Katie from the wedding photos, how she insisted the wheelchair ruined the aesthetics, and how she wanted my daughter erased or drastically edited. I felt myself shaking again, fury returning as I repeated Amelia's cruel demands. David paled, his jaw tightening. Amelia, he said in a strained voice, turning toward her. Is this true? Amelia's eyes darted around the room, like a trapped animal looking for an escape. I just wanted the pictures to look perfect, David. I didn't say I hated Katie. You just what? David's voice rose in disbelief. You wanted her gone from the pictures? The niece I love like my own daughter? The little girl who made my wedding day so special? He shook his head, anger coloring his features. You manipulated me into thinking you were okay with Katie being there. All this time, you've been hiding how you really felt about her, haven't you? Amelia tried to backpedal, offering excuses about color schemes and the child-free nature of the original plan, but David refused to listen. His fists were clenched at his sides, his breathing unsteady as he struggled to keep composure. I can't believe you, he choked out, voice quivering with hurt. Katie is family. She's never been an inconvenience to me, so how could she be an inconvenience to you? My father, who'd been silent until then, finally spoke, voice low and firm. Amelia, I'm shocked. This is beyond rude. You invited that sweet girl to be a part of the wedding, only to treat her like a mistake that needed fixing. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. David, she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, it's your decision, but I don't see how this can continue. David took a breath, his eyes glistening with a mix of rage and sorrow. Turning back to Amelia, he squared his shoulders. "Get out," he said quietly, yet each syllable was weighted with finality. "You can stay with your parents or your friends. I don't care. You'll need to find someplace else to live." Amelia's mouth opened and closed in shock. "You're throwing me out?" He nodded, an unreadable expression on his face. "I can't stay married to someone who hates my niece, who hates my family. Especially not someone who'd demand to have a little girl photoshopped out of wedding pictures." There was a beat of silence, charged and suffocating. Then Amelia let out a frustrated cry, shooting me one last furious glare before grabbing her bag and pushing past David. As she stormed out, the rest of us were left standing in the once celebratory house, each of us grappling with the aftermath of words that had changed everything. And just like that, Amelia was gone, and David was left to wonder how he had ever been fooled into thinking she could be part of our family. The very next day, David found himself bombarded with phone calls from Amelia's parents, pleading and demanding an explanation for why their daughter was suddenly out on the street. They insisted there had to be some misunderstanding. Surely Amelia couldn't have said such terrible things about a child, let alone her new niece. My wife, Linda, and I were at David's house that morning to check on him. We found him standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, as Amelia's father's voice crackled on the other end. We couldn't make out the exact words, but it was clear from the tension in David's posture that they were blaming him for overreacting, urging him to reconsider. At first, David tried to remain calm, explaining how he'd overheard Amelia demanding that Katie be photoshopped out of the wedding pictures. But the conversation quickly escalated. Amelia's parents accused David of overplaying the incident, calling him too sensitive, and even questioning whether Katie's wheelchair was really such a big deal. I saw David's jaw clench, a sure sign his patience was fraying. Before long, he hung up on them, shaking his head in exasperation. "They're just as clueless," he muttered, slumping into a kitchen chair. His eyes flicked toward me, heavy with regret and sorrow. "But I can't pretend this never happened. I won't." Amelia's parents tried another tactic, calling David's phone back an hour later, promising they'd talk some sense into their daughter. They claimed she was just stressed, that it was bridal jitters, making her overreact. But David's mind was set. He repeated, in the calmest tone he could manage, that Amelia's words weren't a momentary lapse. They revealed a deeper cruelty, a shallow way of looking at people, especially someone as special to him as Katie. Soon enough, the story spread to other relatives and mutual friends. Word got around that Amelia had demanded a little girl in a wheelchair be erased from her wedding photos. The backlash was immediate. Aunts and uncles were appalled, while friends texted David to offer support. Many of them had noticed Amelia's oddly dismissive attitude at the reception but didn't realize it ran so deep. Now, they felt compelled to defend Katie, calling Amelia's behavior heartless and indefensible. That evening, David sat down with me, Linda, and our parents to discuss next steps. He announced, without wavering, that he intended to file for an annulment. If she could harbor that much resentment toward my niece, if she could lie so convincingly about wanting Katie to be part of the wedding, then I can't trust anything else she's said or done, he explained, exhaustion lining his face. It stung to see him look so defeated, especially after how elated he'd been just a few days earlier. But as I looked at him, I saw a renewed determination, too. He had one focus: to protect Katie from ever being subjected to Amelia's toxic attitude again. If he had to end his marriage to achieve that, so be it. Our father, never one for lengthy speeches, patted David's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly. Our mother nodded in agreement, tears brimming in her eyes for the son who thought he'd found love, only to discover cruelty instead. As for Amelia, she retreated to her parents' home, only to find that some of her own extended family weren't on her side, either. Once they heard the truth, that she tried to demand money for retouching a child out of photos, several friends and relatives distanced themselves, labeling her actions vile and self-centered. Without David's support or the sympathy of her new in-laws, Amelia found herself isolated. She made a few desperate phone calls to David, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between apologies, excuses, and accusations. Each time, David calmly deleted them without responding. "I know what I heard, and I know what she said," he remarked, his voice unshaken. "I'm not going to subject Katie, or any of us, to her anymore." In the end, Amelia left town, carrying with her whatever she could salvage of her pride. No one bothered to see her off. David's wedding ring lay abandoned in a drawer, his plans for a future with Amelia relegated to a bitter memory. What stuck with me most was the unwavering way David chose Katie over any possible reconciliation with his new wife. He saw the reality clearly. Anyone who hated his niece, who could reduce a 5-year-old to an inconvenient eyesore, was someone he couldn't build a life with. And in that painful clarity, our family found a sense of relief, knowing our little girl would never be forced to endure Amelia's scorn again. Officially, David's marriage to Amelia still exists on paper, but he's already filed for an annulment. The legal process can be slow and full of paperwork, yet there's no real doubt in anyone's mind. This marriage is over. Amelia moved out of town not long after the confrontation, leaving behind the few belongings she had at David's house and taking whatever remained of her pride. Her parents tried to intervene on her behalf, at least initially, but soon realized they were fighting a losing battle. No one who'd learned the full story wanted to defend her request to remove a child from wedding photos, especially a niece who was welcomed in good faith. For me, the author of this messy tale, there's a surprising sense of relief. As heartbreaking as it was to witness David's wedding unravel, I'm glad my daughter Katie won't have to suffer Amelia's snide remarks or toxic behavior. The short, tense marriage acted like a flash of lightning, illuminating Amelia's true colors. Once exposed, there was no going back into the shadows. In the weeks that followed, Katie continued her routine: physical therapy sessions, outings to the park, visits with her grandparents. Yet something has changed for the better. She no longer feels that subtle weight of being judged by someone who should have been family but treated her like an inconvenience. My brother visits us often, bringing little gifts or just popping in to watch cartoons with Katie. He calls her his favorite girl, and the two of them share an easy laughter that reassures me no wedge can ever tear them apart. The rest of the family, too, has come together in unexpected ways. My parents, once awkward around Katie's disability, have grown more confident in how to interact with her, thanks partly to David's unwavering example. Even other relatives, distant cousins and old friends, have stepped forward to show their support, dropping by with meals, offering babysitting help, or simply sending cards that remind Katie she's loved and accepted. Sometimes, I catch Katie looking at the handful of wedding pictures that actually include her. She still smiles at them, remembering the day she got to dress up and toss flower petals, proud that she was an important part of her uncle's ceremony, even if the marriage didn't last. I've asked her a couple times whether she feels sad about everything that happened, but being only 5, she mostly shrugs and says, "I love Uncle David. I'm glad he loves me." And honestly, that's all she really needs to know at this age. For David, the ordeal was painful but clarifying. He tells me he no longer wonders, what if? He knows now that he made the right call by inviting Katie to the wedding, and if that caused Amelia's true nature to surface, then so be it. Better that her hostility appeared sooner rather than later, saving him from a lifetime of tension and resentment. When I reflect on the entire chain of events, I'm struck by how quickly resentment and selfishness can corrode what should be cherished. Amelia could have chosen kindness and acceptance, weaving Katie seamlessly into her life. Instead, her anger and ego led to the collapse of a marriage that had barely begun. It's a sobering reminder that, eventually, the truth always finds its way into the open, and the cruelty or kindness we sow shapes our relationships. In the end, Katie is still the bright, resilient girl who makes everyone around her smile. David, free from a toxic partnership, remains her greatest champion besides me and my wife. And as for Amelia, well, she reminded us all that even the closest bonds can shatter under the weight of bitterness and vanity. A lesson I'll remember every time I see Katie smile in the few wedding photos that remain. Proof that love and honesty can outshine even the darkest of intentions.